Hello, class. This is John Studi, your professor for Philosophy of God at Holy Apostle College and Seminary. Welcome to week 5. This is the lecture for the third way, and we'll also be talking a little bit about Leibniz's contingency argument in comparison to the third way, but we're not going to be spending too much time on that. So most of you have already read the paper that I wrote on the third way for an upcoming conference, and I hope you enjoyed that, and I'm sure you got plenty of good information out of that. However, I wanted to make sure that everything was covered that needs to be covered for the third way, and this is my lecture for you, just to make sure you guys have an audio or a video version of this. So anyway, let's hop right into the third way. The way that I divide the third way is a little bit different from McInerney, and also quite different from the way that McInerney interprets it. But I see the third way as unfolding in 4 distinct stages. First, its starting point, that things generate and corrupt, which is to say that they come into and go out of existence. And these are things that St. Thomas calls possible beings. He then goes on to argue in stage 2 that not everything can be a possible being. This actually results in a reductio ad absurdum, because if not everything can be a possible being, then it must be the case that there is at least one necessary being, which is where we start off in stage 3. In stage 3, it says there must therefore be at least one necessary being, which is to say that something that does not come into or out of existence, but that doesn't mean that a necessary being in this sense can't be caused. A necessary being can either be necessary through itself, per se, or through another, per aliud, or aliud. But necessary beings cannot be per aliud, ad infinitum, so unto infinity. But therefore, there must be at some point something that is necessary through itself, and this is what we call God. Therefore, God exists. Now let's talk about stage 1 here a little bit here. So, St. Thomas starts off with generation and corruption, and in Aristotle we also read about generation and corruption, but for him it simply means substantial form obtaining or adhering in prime matter. And so a tree comes into existence from its parent trees. The substantial form of tree enters in and causes the prime matter to become a tree. Later on, the tree gets struck by lightning, bursts into flames, burns down. The substantial form of tree in that prime matter is lost, and now it's been picked up by the substantial form of ash. And so you see that from one thing corrupting, another thing is generated. And that anything that's generated always comes from something else in existence prior to it. So this is exactly what Aquinas is looking at in terms of the physical world. But Aquinas has a different focus again here. Remember, guys, he's not just looking at the substantial form and the prime matter. Those things are a part of his consideration, but St. Thomas is mostly considering the substance and its essay. And we can see some of this in his parallel argument in the Summa Contra Gentiles, book 1, chapter 15, subsection 5, or paragraph 5, where he talks about how a contingent being or a possible being is something that is possible to exist or not to exist. And just as in when we talk about generation and corruption of material things on the level of natural philosophy, whatever is equally contrary equally related to contraries must be caused. And so the prime matter is in itself is equally related related to either ash or tree. And so we ask, why is it one or the other? And so there has to be a cause for why it is determined, the prime matter is determined as a tree versus being determined as ash, or vice versa. Similarly, generated and corrupted substances are equally related to esse et non esse. So they could either exist or they could not exist. And so Aquinas argues that they must be caused. There must be something determining the substance, or giving the determination of existence to the substance, in the same way that there must be something, a cause, that gives the determination of the formal determination of tree or ash to either the tree or the ash. And so there's a kind of a parallel argument here going on there. St. Thomas is noting that in the world of natural philosophy, prime matter must be determined by another cause, by a cause to give it the formal determination of either tree or ash, just to keep it simple. But on the level of metaphysics, we look at the substance itself, which is equally related to either existing or not existing. And so there must be a cause that determines it, that gives it an existential determination to either existing or not existing. So these things must be caused. And here, in this stage, where St. Thomas is talking about the substances being equally related to esse and not esse, he is gesturing to, once again, that doctrine of essence or nature under absolute consideration and its relationship to esse. Now, here's something important. So when it comes to natural philosophy, generation and corruption moves through time. And here is an essential feature of what Aquinas is saying. Aquinas is not using this premise as a workhorse of his argument, which is as a workhorse of his argument, meaning that in contradistinction to what McInerney does in his book, St. Thomas is not talking about, well, there's one thing generated whose form was generated from something else, whose form was generated from something else, whose form was generated from something else, and so on and so forth. And then, as McInerney says, there has to be a necessary being at the end of this chain, which would be something through time, that would be the necessary being. That would be the first cause here. This is not what St. Thomas is saying at all. Aquinas actually denies this position. This what McInerney argues in the Summa Theologiae, question 46, and Article 2, Reply 3, where he talks about how when it comes to a man, generation and corruption, going back into the past, talking about their parents, is something that could theoretically go on forever. He has no problem of this this overlapping series of existing things giving or granting existence to one another in time. There's no problem for St. Thomas to see that as something that's going to be that's going to stretch back infinitely in time. Rather, again, for Aquinas, what he's doing here is he's starting in the sensible world, which initially for us is going to be about natural philosophy, but what he's doing is he's seeing generation and corruption revealing something about the essence of a substance or of a thing, something that's losing its substantial form or gaining its substantial form. He's not just looking at the substantial form of matter. He's looking beyond it to esse. We have to keep our eyes glued on that principle. And when St. Thomas looks at the principles of a hylomorphic composite, that is, those are things which can gain substantial form or lose substantial form because they are composed of matter and form, which are the two co-principles of an essence, he's seeing that neither the matter nor the form can account for the existence of a thing. And so you're locked in this vicious circular regress, because the form only can give existence to the matter if the form itself has existence. And the matter can't give existence to the form, because matter considered precisely in itself is something that does not exist at all. If matter is to exist, period, it has to have some sort of formal determination. There's not just like this gloopy prime matter floating out there somewhere, but rather whatever material thing we find has some sort of form, some sort of formal determination. But again, since the form could exist or not exist, then it too cannot be the primary source of the existence of the thing. And so in a thing whose essence only includes matter and form, we look for what's necessary in it. So now, if we talk about what's necessary in an essence, we have to consider everything that is necessary to be that kind of thing, whatever those things turn out to be. So for instance, whenever you find a triangle, you will always find that it is a three-sided closed plane figure. Great. Or when we find a cat, if there's a cat somewhere, then that cat is always and necessarily carnivorous. And so what we see in generation corruption is that when we see that it goes into and comes out of existence, but it doesn't lose any of its necessary properties, we still understand exactly what it is, that its essence does not include existence as a necessary property, but something that's added onto it over and above from something outside. And this is because if any essence were to include existence as a necessary property, then it would exist as a matter of necessity, in the same way that wherever you find a triangle, you find the property of three-sidedness. And so in the same way, if there were an essence if there was a substance whose essence included existence necessarily, then it would be the case, again, that it would always exist. But since these things, cats, trees, dogs, rocks, suns, planets, whatever else it might be, can come into and go out of existence, then those things themselves do not have existence as a necessary feature of what they are. Now, let me use my childhood cat here to help explain. Oops, sorry about that. To help explain some of what this means. So, I had a cat when I was younger. My sister brought him in from. Oh, where did she get him? You know, honestly, I don't remember how we got him. Anyway, at some point, he actually lost one of his legs. We don't know exactly how, but what was amazing was this cat was actually able to was still able to hunt birds and hunt mice and be successful with it. Very impressed with this cat. Unfortunately, Elmo did end up developing really bad arthritis in his leg because, you know, obviously he's hobbling around on three legs. It was his hind leg that he lost. He was hobbling around on three legs. He developed really bad arthritis, couldn't move, overate. Eventually, he became diabetic and died. He actually died earlier than other cats who were all older than him. And now, when I talk about Elmo, you know, I think about him. So at some point, Elmo came into existence. He was generated from his parents, right? And before that moment, he didn't exist. Obviously, that's true. For a while, he did enjoy his existence. He enjoyed it more when I guess he had four legs, but you know, I'm sure that he still very much enjoyed existence while he was still a three-legged stool. But eventually, and sadly, he died, and then he actually no longer existed as a real being. But here's the thing: when I talk about Elmo, I know precisely who I am talking about and what I am talking about. I don't think of the idea of Elmo. I think about him. And because of this, I recognize that Elmo's essence is no longer actualized by a real actus essendi, but my knowledge of Elmo does not contain a single notion essential to Elmo. But my knowledge of Elmo does not contain contains the essential features of what it means to be Elmo precisely in itself. But the way that Elmo's essence exists in my mind, because it really is Elmo who I'm thinking about. Again, I'm not thinking about my idea of Elmo, but rather I am thinking about Elmo himself. Now, Elmo's essence exists in my mind with cognitional being, and so he's actually the essence of Elmo is not only something that can exist in real being, but also can exist cognitionally as well. And what this means for Elmo while he's existing is that he can exist in two contrary ways, either cognitionally or he can exist with real existence. And we've talked about this before. And because since he's neutral to both, there has to be a determination for why he exists in one or the other or both. But what's even more is that Elmo's corruption, his death, tells us something about Elmo. His essence does not include a real active existence, and that because he can still lose his real active existence while not losing anything proper to his definition, his essence considered in itself does not include the active existence. So he is something again that is existence neutral. And so what generation and corruption does is it sort of gives us this automatic or really easy entryway or argument or sign that real existence is something that is accidental and added to these things which do come into and go out of existence. And this non-identity that we've talked about before between Elmo's essence and Elmo's existence is what some Thomists have called mitigated non-being. That's basically what an essence is. And so Elmo, considered precisely in himself, the individual Elmo, is existence neutral. It must be caused to exist, not only in the beginning, but also concurrently, because when we talk, we go back to the definition of all possible beings. This is everything that generates and corrupts. So everything that shares that quality, generation, corruption, also shares this property as well. That possible beings are open to existing, or they're open to not existing. It doesn't have to exist, but it also doesn't have to not exist either. It's open to one or the other, and we see this in our everyday experience. We eat our food, and the food ceases to exist precisely as food, or we see things die on the highway, or we squish a bug, or we break a glass. In themselves, they're generating and corrupting, and they're losing their existence precisely as such. And now, when we apply this to the whole of reality, we see that when we're talking about the existence of a thing that generates and corrupts, not only do we need a cause infiere imper accidens, as in Elmo's case, he is generated from his parents, but we also need a cause infiere, a cause in esse and per se, insofar as his continued existence, because it's something that's completely foreign to his essence, must be continually caused in him by an efficient cause. And that which continually causes the existence of things as an efficient cause is what St. Thomas actually calls a necessary being. Now, this is important for the next step. To recap, I guess, a possible being is something that both generates and corrupts, but also relies on some other cause in order for its continued existence. Because the possible being is something that does not have existence of necessity. It's neutral, existentially speaking. So it must be determined at every moment, even after it has come into existence. It must be determined every moment to have this existential determination of being a real being rather than non-being. Which moves us on to stage 2. So where St. Thomas says, it is impossible for these to exist always. For that which is possible at some time, that which is possible to be at some time is not. Therefore, if everything is possible not to be, then at some time. Oh wait, hold on. I'm gonna stay. Yeah. Therefore, if everything is possible not to be, I'm gonna start over here. Blah. Read it again. But it is possible for these always to exist. For that which is possible not to be at some time is not. Therefore, if everything is possible not to be, then at one time there could have been nothing in existence. Therefore, if everything is possible to not be, then at one time there would have been nothing in existence. And then there's the Latin for you. And so now in this stage, it's where most interpreters get stuck. And what Aquinas is doing here is he's actually offering something to someone who would want to deny the existence of a necessary being. He's saying, okay, all right, great. Let's say there are no necessary beings. That is, those things which concurrently cause the existence of all things, or that concurrently cause the existence of a thing, of a substance. And Aquinas is saying that if that were true, if there were no necessary beings, then there would be no cause. Then there would be nothing now. But that seems pretty probable, or rather, actually, he says that there would be nothing in existence at one point. Great. So at one point in time, there would have been nothing in existence if there are no such thing as necessary beings. And there's a few different interpretations of this view. So you have the past non-existence view, which focuses on generation. So somebody who argues this would be Michael Agros, and to some extent Mack and O'Neill. They both take a different twist. They have a different twist on it. Whereas Michael Agros, who I generally like him, he's a really, really sweet dear man. But the way he looks at this is he says that if it was the case at one time in the past that so if we look at generation, so whenever a thing generates, it comes from something else, and prior to its generation, it did not exist. So obviously, when we talk about a single thing, before it was generated, it didn't exist. Great, that's hardly even controversial. And the next step for him is very difficult. The next step here, let me back up. Next step for him, so he's only at this stage here, and this is what he's saying about about generation. So if it's impossible for things, but it's impossible for these things to always to exist. For that which is possible not to be at some time is not. Great, and that sometime it's not for McInerney and for Agros would be that, well, for generated things, before they were generated, they didn't exist. Great, no problem. And then we have future non-existence views, which focus on corruption. You know, I think corruption is important to this argument, but it's not going to get us to the next stage. And so this one is focusing more on this aspect here. This aspect here again, part 1 of stage 2. Where it says for that which is possible to be at some time is not. And so they take this at some time to mean in the future a thing that comes into existence, that is something that's material, is going to necessarily, by pain of irrationality, cease to exist. Now there might be some merit to this case, but it's really controversial. As you guys read in the paper, people like Mackey would argue that there seems to be nothing contradictory about a billiard ball floating around for all eternity. Insofar as nothing actually actively destroys it, it seems like it's going to remain intact with all of its material integrity. And now, I think both of these are important. The past non-existence view tells us that a thing comes into existence only from something already in existence. And so if something is caused to exist, then whatever is causing that thing to exist either has to exist at some time in the past, like my grandparents had to exist at some time in the past and no longer exist, but they were nevertheless a cause of my existence in a limited fashion. But also, when it comes to things that are concurrently existing something, that thing, that cause, also has to exist in order for the effect to exist. And so in the same way that you have a desk holding up a cup, if the desk itself didn't exist or wasn't held aloft from the ground, it couldn't do the same thing to the cup. And so whatever is causing possible things to exist concurrently must also be an existing thing. Now, when it comes to the future non-existence view, I think that this is important because we see, at the very least, and inductively speaking, I think this bears out. Everything in our experience, be it trees, people, animals, even basic minerals and stars, galaxies, black holes, all these things cease to exist at some point. Whether or not that's per se necessary for them to cease to exist is another issue. Especially considering St. Thomas actually says that some possibilities can go unactualized. It's possible for some potentialities to go unactualized. So that's actually almost contrary to some of St. Thomas's own principles with respect to active potency. But regardless, yeah, we see things go in and out of existence all the time, and go out of existence, and it's a common part of our life. And so even if not deductively true, the future non-existence view at least has quite a bit of inductive power. And what it reveals to us, again, is that at the very least for those things that do go out of existence, we know that they don't exist necessarily and that they must have a concurrent cause for their existence. And then there's a third view, which is the conditional or metaphysical non-existence. And this actually focuses on per se causality, and it's focusing on the existence of a thing right here and right now. And so why does the thing that continues to exist? Well, it's because it's being caused to exist. And so when somebody who takes on this conditional view looks at, but it is impossible for these to always to exist, for that which is possible not to be at some time is not. They actually look at this conditional, they look at this at some time is not, and this for these always to exist in a conditional sense. And so if it were the case, for instance, that there were that the cause of the current cause of existing things, existing possible things, were to cease to exist or were never there, then, well, it wouldn't exist. So if my cup wasn't being held aloft by my desk, then my cup would fall to the ground immediately. So in the same way, if there wasn't something causing a thing to exist in the present or at every moment, then that thing, which in itself is existence neutral, would just dissipate to nothingness. And this, I think, actually solves some of the problems that people see in the third way. The third way is often accused of two fallacies at this stage, either the quantifier shift or a fallacy of composition. A quantifier shift is a fallacy where you are changing the extension of a term from every single thing, so you're looking at the singular proposition, to all things. You're looking at a universal proposition. Good example of this is if you say you're a shepherd, and as a shepherd you have a lot of sheep, and all these sheep have a mother. Therefore, they have the same mother. Clearly, that's not how this works. The sheep, there might be one extremely prolific sheep in terms of its reproduction, where she's had 150,000 lambs. I highly doubt it, although that'd be a huge herd. Although I hear there's more sheep in New Zealand than there are people. Interesting fact. Anyway, but it's clearly fallacious to say that every single thing, every single sheep, because it has a mother, that every sheep in the whole herd has the same mother. Clearly fallacious. And so in the same way, as J.H. Sobel here points out, it seems if we take, and I think that both the past non-existence view and the future non-existence view fall into this trap. They would both fall into a quantifier shift, because as Sobel says, the Tertia Via may depend on an illicit reference of its own, from everything in nature cannot be to everything in nature at some time was not, to at one time there was in the natural world nothing in existence. But even if everything at some time was not, it did not follow at some time everything was not. Or equivalently, that at some time nothing was. Sobel's logic and theism, which again, this guy Sobel has often been called the final boss of atheism. And between us, I am so glad that he is called the final boss of atheism, because his arguments, while they're going to throw some, certainly beginners and intermediate students of St. Thomas for a loop, or pose some difficulties, for somebody who's really well versed in St. Thomas's metaphysics and St. Thomas's writings, he doesn't pose a problem at all. And even for somebody who's a beginner or intermediate, you can be able to go to his book and be able to pick apart quite a few of his arguments against St. Thomas's second way and third way, with reference to this lecture. But we'll see how this is resolved in just a moment here. And then the second fallacy that the third way is often accused of is the fallacy of composition, which argues illicitly from parts to whole. For instance, all of my parts as a human are not persons. Therefore, I am not a person. So it's making an illicit argument from my parts to my whole. Let's talk about the quantifier shift. All right, so look at McInerney's solution, where we see this past event, this past series of things which at one time didn't exist. And so he says on the singular level that a thing which was generated at some point didn't exist. And then he says, well, if this were the case, then at some point all things would have not existed. Wait, does that follow? No, of course, this doesn't make any sense. Let's look back here. Could it be the case, like St. Thomas says in his Summa Theologiae 46, that we have an infinite series of one man generating another? Well, yes, there's nothing that's logically incoherent about that. It may be factually incoherent, but we don't know that yet. And so this view fails in itself to actually reach the conclusion that there at one point was nothing in existence, at one point there was nothing in existence, or that necessarily at one point there was nothing in existence, because you could always have this overlapping series of things into the past which are generated or corrupted. And the same thing is true for the future non-existence view, because even though all individual things might cease to exist at one point or another, it's again not necessary for there to be at some point when all things cease to exist out of necessity or period, full stop. I have a son, someday he'll have a son, and then I'll die, and then someday my son's son will have a son, and then someday my son will die, and then my son's son's son will have a son, and so on and so forth. There's no logical contradiction to say that this could continue on forever. And so it fails to meet this quantifier shift, or it fails to overcome this quantifier shift fallacy. And so I think McInerney's position is not only non-optimistic, but it's also something that does not avoid these accusations from people who are skeptical of the third way's efficacy. How about the fallacy of composition? Well, again, McInerney's solution fails, and so does the future non-existence argument fails as well. Because if it's the case that everything everything that existed in the past at some point didn't exist, it doesn't mean that the whole of the past things didn't exist at all, because it could be, again, this infinite regress of per accidens generators which overlap with one another all the way back into the past, and so there's no necessary connection to the singular statement that a generated thing at one point didn't exist. It must be generated by another. To at one point all generated things didn't exist. Doesn't work that way. And the same thing with the future non-existent solution, in that it goes all the way to, if we point all the way to the future, well, the same thing. We have these things which at some point will go out of existence. Doesn't mean that the whole of them will go out of existence at some point or at the same time. That doesn't work that way. For the exact same reasons why it fails to pass muster on the quantifier shift fallacy. How about the conditional non-existence view? Well, this makes a lot of sense, because possible beings, which are things that generate and corrupt and then require a thing to maintain them in existence concurrently, only exist when they are caused to exist by something which exists necessarily. And these necessary beings are the per se cause of these possible beings. And so what is the justification? And so if we look at that, it completely avoids the quantifier shift. But before I get there exactly, I want to look at what this conditional view is and how we get to this position. And so when we... let me get to the right spot here. There we go. So in the conditional view, what we're looking at is this term time, or the when of possible things not existing. And in the Latin here, in the Latin of St. Thomas's Third Way, we have an interesting word. We have the word quando. In the Latin, it's quandoque, which means at some point. And quando can also be used not only temporally, but also with respect to a certain state of affairs. An example of this would be in Summa Theologiae, question 33, article 6, I think it's reply 3, where Aquinas points out the conditions when, quando, certain fraternal corrections are actually a good thing. And so if we understand Aquinas' phrase to mean, if it were the case that nothing was causing the existence of possible things, then all possible things would cease to exist, or not exist at all, then we actually overcome both the quantifier shift and the fallacy of composition. So when we look at this, again here, we look at the conditional view, when we talk about the time, or the at some point, or when, we're all talking about these things conditionally. So the time at which possible things don't exist is when they do not have a concurrent external cause for their existence. And so this not only avoids the quantifier shift, but states something that should be straightforwardly obvious. If a thing does not have existence, then it clearly does not exist. And so we can look at the individual quantifier shift here. It's actually, on the conditional view, it's actually a propter quid argument. That is, that if everything is possible not to be, then at some time it would not be. When that some time being that when they were not concurrently caused to exist. That's a propter quid argument. It's you could formulate it to be, it would have to be a sorority, so it would have to be a couple syllogisms, but essentially you get to all things which are caused by are caused to exist must have a concurrent cause for their existence, but nothing has a concurrent cause for its existence. Therefore, all these things which must have a cause for their existence do not have a cause for their existence, and therefore they do not exist. It's a straightforward argument, and it's logically airtight. So there's no quantifier shift here, because it applies to all things which come in generation and which are generated and corrupted. It also avoids the fallacy of composition, and the reason for this is that fallacy compositions are sometimes true. While it's not true of, it would be a fallacy composition to argue that all the sheep in the herd have the flock have the exact same mother. It is not a fallacy to say that a brick wall is red when all of its bricks are red. So if a brick wall is made out of only bricks, then it's the case, and in all these cases, and all these bricks are red, then it's the case that we can say of the whole that the brick wall is red. And so, in the same way, the whole natural order is just a collection of its parts. And if all the things that were in the natural order are possible beings, but these possible beings don't have a cause for their existence, then, if the natural order is just a collection of its parts, and that's all it is, just the same way that the brick wall is a collection of the bricks, then it's the case that because every part of the natural order is possible, then the whole of the natural order is possible. And if the whole of the natural order is possible, then it has to have a constant cause, a necessary cause or necessary being which causes its existence, because those necessary beings cause the existence of every single one of the parts. So it also avoids the composition fallacy. And now, what matters here, or what's going on here, is in stage 2, or the last part of stage 2, is St. Thomas argues that, continues to say that if it were the case that in the past nothing existed because there was no necessary being to bring things into existence or to cause things to concurrently exist, then there would be nothing now. Even if we had infinite time, we could wait around forever and nothing new would come into existence. If there was nothing yesterday, there's going to be nothing today. If there's nothing on Wednesday, there's nothing on Thursday. If there's nothing on Thursday, there's nothing on Friday. It's just insane. And so there would be nothing now. But this is absurd. There has to be something now. Or there has to be, because things exist now. If there was nothing in the past, there would be nothing now. But since there are things now, we can know that, contrary to the supposition we took earlier that all things are possible beings, that there has to be a necessary being which sustains things in existence at every moment. Which means that there must be a necessary being. And we know this because things exist now. So the logical inference of St. Thomas's argument here of saying that if every single thing were possible not to be, then at some time it were not, and if all things are of this kind, that is possible beings, then at some point all of them would not exist. That at some point is when those things do not have a cause for their existence. Then all things would not exist. Period. But if nothing ever existed in the first place, because they were all possible beings, and these are absolutely possible beings insofar as they exist neutrally, then nothing would have ever come into existence, because they can only come into existence because of the agency of something already in existence, but we've already said that there's nothing in existence. So again, there would be nothing now. But since there are things now, we can know that there is a necessary being, at least one necessary being. Now that is really, really complicated. And kind of difficult to understand. I cover it in the paper, and I think it's probably a little clearer there than what I just said. I got distracted for a moment, sorry. But it's not necessary for the argument. St. Thomas is kind of throwing this in here for rhetorical effect. He's granting the premise, or he's just positing or like hypothetically saying, okay, great. My opponent says that there's no such thing as a necessary being. Okay, what are the logical consequences of that? Well, that nothing would exist in the past, which would mean nothing would exist now. But since things do exist now, we know that it's not true that only possible things exist. Therefore, because of the law of contrary opposites, if it's not possible that only possible things exist, if that's impossible, then it is necessary that one necessary being must exist. And so he's taken the opposite stance of the one he holds to show that it's absurd to prove his own position as being necessarily entailed by the fact that things exist now. Hopefully that helped a little bit. Moving on to stage 3. So St. Thomas comes to the point where he says that there must be at least one necessary being which is to say something that does not come into or out of existence, that can be necessary either through itself per se, or it can be necessary through another. And here we see a reference to the second way, which argues from efficient causality, where Aquinas eliminates the possibility of an infinite series of necessary efficient causes ordered per se and in esse. And we know that in this per se causal series, which is the kind of third way, all causal action must terminate in the existence of a being which exists and causes existence, or is the source of its own existence, which is a per se being, which we've talked about a million times. And so when we talk about necessary beings, St. Thomas's third way, we see that possible beings, or necessary beings, can be either per aliud or per se. And so for per aliud things, they are not strictly necessary. They're only necessary because something else is causing their necessity. The A, which we could say is a possible being, is caused by B, which is a necessary being, which is caused by C, which is another necessary being. But B and C, but B is a per aliud, and C could be per aliud, or it could be per se. Now the question is, can these go on forever? Well, the answer is no. We've talked about that a million times, because you would ultimately arrive at the impossible notion of. So again, as we talked about before, this is not a necessary aspect of St. Thomas's argument, but it's something that, again, he's granting to his opponent, saying, okay, yeah, all right, his opponent says, okay, fine, there's a necessary being, but what caused that necessary being? And St. Thomas says, okay, well, great, let's consider that. Let's say that necessary being exists, but it's not something that exists in and of its own right. It's not a per se necessary being. We haven't gotten to a first cause. That would mean that this necessary being has to have its necessity caused in it. But what would that mean? And so just to think about this for a moment, what does it mean to be a necessary cause being? A cause necessary being. Just as a mental exercise, imagine a ball resting on a pillow that exists throughout eternity. The pillow in itself does not have the capacity to have the round indentation of that's in the shape of a ball impressed upon it. Okay. But the ball does. So, for all eternity, if this pillow were to exist, then the pillow would have that indent caused in it by the ball. Okay, that's what it would mean for a thing to, by necessity, by necessity be caused in some way. But again, this can't go on forever, because then you have a bunch of existentially neutral things, which are piling up together to somehow make something that is existentially positive. And we've talked about this before, where it's impossible for us to have even the humblest of fundamental particle, if it's only existentially neutral things in its causal history. And again, we're talking about per se, not per accidens, because, like I've said before, it's not, you can't have 0 plus 0 plus 0 plus 0 equal 1. You have to have something existentially positive in that series in order to get something that is existentially positive in the effect. And when we get to a thing, a being which exists, a necessary being which exists per se and exists necessarily, it does so in virtue of its essence. It does so in virtue of its own essence. And so here, its essence is identical to its existence. Because again, remember, if something is necessary per se in a thing, then wherever we find it, it must have that quality necessarily, and in every possible world, to borrow some language from modal logic. So again, we talked about before, in every possible world, a cat is going to be a predator, or every possible world, water is going to be H2O. Its chemical makeup is going to be H2O. And so in the same way, if we get to something whose existence is necessary through itself, then it exists in all possible worlds, and its existence is its very essence. And it also happens to be, as St. Thomas says in the third way, the cause of the necessity or the existence in all things, and therefore it causes all things. And here, J.L. Mackie, in his book Miracle of Theism, actually accuses Aquinas of committing yet another quantifier shift fallacy by saying that if it's the case that, or that even if everything has a cause for its existence, it doesn't mean that everything has the same cause. Well, that might be true for some versions of the cosmological argument, like the Kalam cosmological argument, or like maybe Leibniz's contingency argument, but not for St. Thomas's cosmological arguments, and certainly not for his contingency argument either. And the reason for this is found directly in this existential core of Aquinas' 5 ways that we've talked about before. So remember, we have to focus on this doctrine of esse, and when we do this, the alleged fallacy of quantifier shift fallacy disappears, because we've arrived at something which is of its very essence the act of existence. So it is ipsum esse subsistens. But in order to have more than one thing in which essence is identical to its existence, then there would have to be some sort of real principle of differentiation to make one really distinct from the other. However, there's no distinction between essence and existence in this first necessary thing. And because there's no, which means that it is ipsum esse subsistens, or esse purus. Its nature is existence. But since there's nothing, and there can't even conceptually be any principle outside of esse that you could add to esse, then the only thing you could add to it would be nothing. But then this would just be another case where esse is constricted by nothingness. So it would be a mitigated nothingness. So it would be an essence. And so there would be an essence that's distinct from the existence. And so we'd have just yet another thing which is existentially neutral. So you'd have, at least one or two things that are, very, high up on the chain of perfection, the chain of being, but ultimately have an essence that's really distinct from its existence. But again, this thing would have to have its necessary existence caused in it by another. It would be a per aliud thing. Anything that has an essence distinct from its existence, even if it existed forever, would be something that has this existence caused in it by another, because it's existentially neutral and therefore must be caused in it by something ultimately that has existence in it by its very essence. So again, we come to the reality that everything in which has everything that has an essence distinct from its existence, whether it be a necessary being or a possible being, is ultimately caused by something in whom essence and existence are identical. But there can only be one thing in whom essence and existence are identical. Therefore, there is only one cause for all things whose essence and existence are distinct, which is everything other than the thing whose essence and existence are identical. So we avoid that quantifier shift fallacy quite easily. And so now, why do we call this God? Well, we have to remember that esse is the perfection of all perfections. And when we consider esse rightly, even just in itself, thinking about existence, it has the broadest extension, and it excludes absolutely no perfection or no quality that we find, no unlimited quality that we find in being. And so existence considered in itself has this unlimited perfection, unlimited scope. We'll talk more about this when we get to the fourth way, and also when we talk more about the perfections and attributes of God. And so when we come to the existence of a thing whose essence is existence, we find this abstract notion of, if existence has all the perfections, we find that concretized in this being whose essence is existence. And I think St. Thomas plays this beautifully, says this beautifully in the De Ante Essentia, where he says that God has all the perfections which are in every genus. This is why he is called simply perfect, as if, yada, yada, yada. But he has all these perfections in a more excellent way than all things, because he has them, because in him they are one, whereas in all other things they have diversity. And this is so because all these perfections belong to him according to a simple existence. If someone could perform the operations of all qualities through one quality, he would have every quality in that one quality. So too, God has all these perfections in his existence itself. And again, remember that all the perfections of things pertain to the perfections of esse. For all things are perfect precisely insofar as they have esse, and if God has esse in some unlimited fashion, he has all his perfections in an unlimited manner that's analogous to the way that we have them now. And again, we're talking more about that, what that means, and make that a little more comprehensible and easy to understand in a couple weeks. And so Aquinas rightly concludes that whatever is this thing that is necessarily existing through itself is God, because at the very, if we can say that God has the perfections of all things, he's unlimitedly perfect, and so this would mean he has goodness, truth, and beauty all by essence. He is the absolute epitome of intelligence and love and power. All of these things are perfections that are unlimited in themselves, and although they're limited in creatures, they're unlimited in God. So just to recap the third way, I'm just going to quickly run through this. We see things in the world that generate and corrupt, which means that they come from another and cease to exist eventually, or at least some things do. But whatever generates comes into existence is caused to exist through another. In possible beings, we find matter gaining or losing substantial form. But neither substantial form nor prime matter can account for existence, since both are open to esse and non-esse. So the continued existence of these possible things require a cause, which we call a necessary being, because a continued effect requires a continued cause. But if a possible thing didn't have a cause for its existence, a necessary being, either now or in the past, then it just wouldn't exist. So therefore, if we propose a whole cosmos of possible beings without a cause, then nothing would have existed. And we could even wait around for all eternity. Nothing would come into existence. And indeed, nothing would exist now, which of course is absurd. And so, since something exists now, we have to know that it's impossible for things to only have possible for the whole cosmos to be made out of possible things, or the whole of reality be made up of only possible things. Hence, there must be something other than possible beings, which we would call a necessary being. These necessary beings can either be necessary through themselves or through another. We can't have necessary beings through another ad infinitum, so we must come to a thing which is necessary through itself. And because of all the perfections of esse, this thing has all the perfections of esse, and this is what we call God. Therefore, God exists. Now, quickly, I'm going to go through the Leibnizian contingency argument. This one is going to be a bit more popular. I'll post a video from William Lane Craig, who gives a quick 5-minute summary of this argument, where he argues for the Leibnizian contingency argument, which is going to be more popular in contemporary apologetics and philosophy of God than St. Thomas's third way, partly because people simply don't understand St. Thomas's third way. Now, the Leibnizian contingency argument begins with the law of sufficient reason. A thing must have a sufficient reason for its existence in itself or another. Hey, I'm perfectly fine with that. A really good friend of mine wrote a dissertation called In Defense of the Principle of Sufficient Reason. You can buy it on Amazon. It's a fantastic book. I highly recommend it. This principle is extremely helpful to a lot of St. Thomas's metaphysics. St. Thomas doesn't have this principle in its in the exact formulation that we find it in Leibniz and subsequent philosophers, but we find it in St. Thomas, at least in germinal form. And so, based on this principle of sufficient reason, Leibniz will go on to say that a thing which has the reason for its existence in itself is necessary and requires no cause. Okay, so that's a necessary thing. A thing which has sufficient reason for its existence in another is contingent and requires a cause. And Leibniz and other contemporary proponents of the Leibnizian style contingency arguments say that the universe is something that is contingent and therefore requires a cause. But there can't be an infinite regress of essentially ordered instrumental causes of the existence of things. And so there can't be a bunch of contingent things in order to say that these things exist. And so therefore there must be a principal cause which is not contingent but is necessary. And so it seems really similar to Aquinas' third way, and a lot of it really is. And I think that one thing that's really cool about this argument is you can say that if all things are contingent beings, you could never just point to the whole set of contingent things and say this whole set constitutes a necessary thing. Why? Well, it's for the same reason why you couldn't paint a wall with black paint long enough or with enough black paint to ever make it red, because you'd be moving from one contrary opposite to the other by a successive addition of one contrary opposite. You can't get from black to white in the same way. You can't get from contingent things by adding more contingent things. You can't get to a necessary being from contingent being by adding contingent being upon contingent being, in the same way you can't get to black by adding white paint to white paint. And so you have to have eventually something black added to the paint in order to start getting that black color you're looking for. So in the same way, you have to have a necessary being in order to get to this existence that we find here and now. Now, there's a couple of differences here. So real quick, Leibniz's arguments are a little bit different from Aquinas's. So it begins with definitions. Leibniz says, so here's what I'm going to call a contingent being, here's what I'm going to be a necessary being. And then he goes on and works out this argument in his head, and all of it's logically sound. It follows perfectly well. But this actually falls into the Kantian objection, and Kant, in a nutshell, argued that the logical notions that we have don't necessarily map onto reality, but rather there's something that we project onto the world. And so we don't actually know if these terms, contingent or necessary, actually apply to things in the real world. And that's a problem. I think that the people who defend Leibnizian style contingency arguments would have their own ways of going around this, but they're really complicated. St. Thomas, on the other hand, he actually begins with sense experience. He draws in from reality what reality is, and he finds that in reality there are things that he eventually comes to call contingent beings, and there are also necessary beings. This is where we're seeing the usefulness of looking at generation and corruption, because something that's generated was at one point dependent upon something existing prior to it, and which was necessary. And this is a per accidens necessity, but from that, St. Thomas can start to abstract other kinds of necessity which do apply to the real world. And so, whereas the Leibnizian style arguments begin with definitions and kind of in the logical realm, St. Thomas's arguments begin in the philosophical realm and actually draw from reality. So Leibniz applies his definitions to the world, whereas Aquinas derives his definitions from the world. There's also no Leibnizian arguments also seem to treat the whole universe as contingent, and require that. But to say that the whole universe came into existence or is necessarily dependent on some necessary thing. But Aquinas works with even just one possible contingent thing, because from just one possible contingent thing, we get to something in whom essence and existence coincide. And since everything else, which we talked about earlier, since if there's only one thing in whom essence and existence coincide, everything else has to have an existence distinct from its essence. But if that's the case, their existence must be caused in them by another, and ultimately something which has existence in essence coinciding. And so St. Thomas can just look at one thing, but Leibniz would have to look at the whole of reality to get to its conclusion that everything that is not a necessary being through itself is something that depends on a necessary being through itself. Whereas Aquinas can just look at one thing. Leibniz has to look at the whole reality. Also, Leibniz's argument might not lead to God. It just leads to a necessary being, but that doesn't tell us very much. But again, Aquinas' argument leads us to God because of the perfections of essence, of existence. So I'm going to end there before it gets any longer. Thank you very much. And if you guys have any questions, go ahead. Look at my paper. Again, a lot of the same stuff that I said here is in the paper. There are a few things here and there that I've added. And if you guys have any further questions, please let me know. And we can set up a time to talk online, on the phone, or we can just even converse over email. Thank you, and God bless.